Hi, Rice here. We're going to take a look at pivot tables to try and see how they make relationships more apparent in a big data set like this. So what we've got is all of the data from one of the football teams that we're analyzing. And when we take a look at this, sometimes it's too much to take on at once. So instead, what I'm going to do is use a pivot table to sort of sort and filter these ideas. So in order to do that for all of this, I'm going to highlight just a piece of data and hit Control A. Now I've got it all selected, and from there I can just say insert a pivot table. Actually, here you can see if with Control A it selects all the data stuff and nothing too much extra. So there, Control A, and then insert a pivot table, and I'm going to do it in a new worksheet just because I don't want to mess with this particular sheet. So there we go, we've got this, and now it's ready to do a pivot table. This is pivot table 2. I just did one a second ago, and so it's building a pivot table. Now to build a pivot table, there's a lot of things that you can do. So all of these are your different properties. These are the different columns that I had. And so for those, I'm going to take a look at maybe bring down field position, and I'll bring down, let's do our offensive formation. So we'll bring those down. And these are the different offensive formations that showed up on different field positions. So you can see here, these would be as you move down the line, down the field in yardage. These are the formations that show up. So that's interesting, and maybe I could find a pattern that shows up that some of these things are more likely to be found early and others are more likely to be found later. So pivot tables are interesting because you can take a lot of these things, and let's see if I can drag in another one. Maybe I'll put in the distances. And so these are all distances that you have for this. I don't know, maybe I'm a little mistaken there. That might be something else. That's a count of distances. But the idea here is that you can sort of drag and drop a, let's see, not count of downs, but rows. We'll say what row they were, or what down they were on. So all of these are just different things that you can move around into the pivot table in different ways. And you can see they relate differently, right? A row would be another row here in your table. You can take things and make them columns. So I can say what columns they're in, and you can arrange them differently. You can look at sums. So this would be adding up all the different things. So this is only one down that was there. There were 2 downs on the 16-yard line, and once and one, they were a loose or slot twin gun strong. So there's a couple different ways that you can organize these. And some of them are more interesting. Like on the 25-yard line, lots of things show up, but that's because of the way that's what the punt return probably. So there were a bunch of plays there, and they had a few different lineups for how they played with that. And some of them showed up more than once. Like this one showed up 5 times. So that's interesting. So with that, we've got a few different patterns that we can start to realize out of this. But the thing that I really like about pivot tables is that you don't necessarily need to know what you're doing when you start, and that's really nice. Because if you're writing functions, usually you need to know what you want your function to do so that you can write it in the correct way beforehand. But for pivot tables, you just say, I want a pivot table, and then you can play around until you find relationships that you may not have known were there. And so pivot tables are really helpful because there's a low barrier to entry. But another thing about them that's really cool is that you can actually get really advanced with pivot tables and do a combination of functions and pivot tables so that you're defining your own columns in the table so that your pivot tables have more interesting things to look at. Like here, this field position one is actually a field that I defined in another video. So I wrote this column based on derived data from the yard line, and then I'm able to use that data in a pivot table, which will help me get even better data, or even better interpretations from the information in this data set. So you can get really advanced with pivot tables, but it's also a really low barrier to entry, which is why they're one of my favorite tools in Microsoft Excel. So hopefully this helps, and I would encourage you to get started with pivot tables and just explore, see if you can find any patterns or trends. All right, that's it. Good luck.